on the race to systematise service innovation, how to make the changes in practice and mindset sustainable. Before we start, a couple of basic points. Can you keep your mic and video switched off? If you have a question or just a point that you want to make, can you please place it in the chat function, which for those of you familiar with Teams, you'll know this is on the right-hand side of your screen and everyone can access. I'll pick up your questions during the Q&A. I've got a couple of invigilators who will sift and try to avoid duplicates or questions that have already been covered to help make sure that we cover as much as of the topics that you're raising in the time that we have available. The format today is quite straightforward. After a short introduction from me, we'll hear from our two speakers, Professors Mary Dixon-Woods and Gary Ford, after which we will have the Q&A session based on your queries. This webinar is part of a series that we're running at the NHS Confederation as part of our NHS Reset campaign, which is designed to try and help shape what the health and care system should look like in the aftermath of the pandemic. And I'm delighted today that we're doing this in partnership with the Health Foundation and the Academic Health Science networks. It has been one of the most remarkable features of this awful and traumatic period that it's produced an extraordinary and I think largely unexpected flowering of innovation. What seemed impossible has become possible. Lots of leaders saying what would have taken us years has been delivered in days. So today's webinar is focused on how we can build on the many service innovations and products across health and care, including how can we avoid waste in innovation, make the most of the expertise available and produce solutions that can work across the patch, as well as figuring out what works, what doesn't, and just as important, why that is. Some of what we've already seen will just continue to fly. Innovations will just go on and we won't go back. Some will require, I think, real effort to make them sustainable, and some may not be maintained in their current form. And of course, I think we do all recognise that a lot of this is cultural. Success comes from embracing things like continuous improvement, empowering our staff, clear leadership around innovation and all that, as well as identifying areas where technical interventions can support and assess the value of innovation. Certainly simple necessities have been partly responsible for the advances thus far, where organisations might previously have been risk averse, a kind of just do it mentalities emerged. But the COVID response funding, well, that has obviously helped, but given that it will go, it's not going to be there forever, we need to address the question as to how we can sustain this change and at least in part the pace of change as well. I remember Chris Wormald, the permanent secretary at the Department of Health, when he first came over from education, said he found that the health service was unusual because there was more innovation occurring in health than he'd noticed in education, but there was a dearth of what he called second adopters. And that is a big challenge for us, I think, going forward, of making sure that we learn how to spread innovation more effectively. And I know obviously the AHSNs and indeed this institute are both pioneers at helping to try and encourage that a second adoption, if I can put it that way, or the spread of innovation. I think it's also finally fair to say the quality of IT infrastructure has also been pretty inconsistent, and we do have to tackle the arcane system of capital funding. So we need to have a serious talk with the Treasury around that, which can still stifle progress as capital funding tends to be annual, and just the ability of organisations to plan is so difficult. But there is momentum at the moment, and that should mean that we have a window of opportunity to make this innovation mindset more business as usual for the whole service. And with this pace of innovation, we do need to make sure that learning is captured and used effectively. And that brings me to our first speaker. Professor Mary Dixon-Woods is the Health Foundation Professor of Improvement Studies at Cambridge University and Director of this institute. She's going to talk about the importance of evaluation and share some of the techniques that they're using at the institute, particularly its outsourcing platform. Let me hand you over now to Mary. Mary.
Hello, everyone, and thanks very much for that introduction, Neil. It's a great opportunity great privilege to be able to talk to people this afternoon to share some of what we've been doing, much of which I think is going to address the issues that you've already begun to raise, Neil, about some of the challenges of innovation in the NHS and some of the issues about scaling. So obviously, I don't need to say what an extraordinary period we've all lived through. And Neil has already alluded to how quickly the NHS literally and figuratively rolled up its sleeves and innovated in a most tremendously agile and impressive way on a scale we have never seen before. So just extraordinary efforts and extraordinary achievements over the last few months. I'm going to sound a slightly cautionary note for a few minutes, because one of the things we have seen as we have been observing this extraordinary period has been not only great achievement, but also some of the challenges of doing improvement and innovation in the NHS more generally being replicated in the response to the crisis. And if anyone is interested to read more about this, it's summarised in my paper from a couple of years ago, where I outlined some of the challenges. And I'm going to focus a little bit on some of these, which were also described in my essay in the BMJ last year, in the context of the response to the COVID crisis. One of these is the lovely baby problem, and I'll spend just a minute or two giving you an example of this. A second problem Neil has already alluded to, and this is the lack of coordination in improvement innovation, which then leads to waste in innovation and lack of harmonisation. Sometimes lack of participation by the relevant stakeholders, resulting in a poor solution. Absence of shared understanding of what good looks like from multiple perspectives, so particular group's view being imposed on everyone and not necessarily that being signed up to by everyone. And sometimes the relevant stakeholders aren't involved in addressing the problem and then feel, as Neil had said, that they don't have ownership and that it's not scalable. And finally, the problem of poor curation and description, which means that evaluation is frustrated. So I'm going to spend a minute or two just describing the lovely baby problem and then something much more positive. So the lovely baby problem is something I've talked about. Anyone who's heard me speak before has heard me talk about this. And this is basically the problem that once people have come up with an idea, they tend to get very invested in it. And we've seen several examples of this during the pandemic, but I'll just give one. And that is the example of the aerosol box. And some of you may well have seen this. It was proposed back in March by some colleagues from Taiwan, and the basic idea didn't look silly, it looked quite sensible. And this was the idea that during aerosol generating procedures, typically intubation procedures, you would encase the patient's upper body in a plastic box with the idea that this would then reduce risk of contamination. It appeared to be a simple, cheap solution, quite plausible actually. And a letter written to the New England Journal seemed to suggest that it did in fact offer some protection in terms of droplets. It didn't offer any data on smaller particles. And there was some controversy at the time, but the authors wrote in May saying it's critically important to use every possible measure, including this one, they seem to suggest, to ensure patient safety while protecting healthcare personnel. So there was a lot of evidence actually of rapid diffusion worldwide of the aerosol box. We were seeing GoFundMe campaigns and other efforts to raise money for them. People were offering to make these boxes in their garages using 3D printers. There was a lot of sort of momentum behind this solution, but it was completely unevaluated, really. When some engineers got their hands on it, people who are experts in air filtration systems and ran some simulations through it, they actually showed that there was an effect of the patient's breath essentially billowing outside it, outside the box, and potentially increasing infection. This simulation crossover study, really quite nice design, showed that basically there were higher risks to the patients because the operator's arms and other movements were so constricted, it increased the length of the procedure and increased risk of injury to patients. And then this very famous study, which appeared in June, in anaesthesia, which was, again, an extremely interesting and well-designed study, comparing various different types of protection devices, including the aerosol box, came to a very sobering conclusion, which was that the use of the aerosol box resulted in a marked increase in airborne particle exposure compared with other devices, and basically said we should not be using them. They're not safe. They have not been shown to be safe, and they may in fact increase rather than decrease risks. So I'm telling that as a kind of cautionary tale, because this is a repeated finding of innovation and improvement, that it's very easy to get what looks like a plausible and good idea, and it may not be, without evaluation and without proper study, it may not actually be the solution we're looking for. So I'm going to focus now on more positive stories and how we could do better. And Neil has already alluded to the problem that waste is one of the features of innovation, and we have seen this all over the service since the pandemic. Everybody coming up with their own SOP in response to a particular procedure. And I'm going to offer some examples of how you can avoid the, sorry, I've managed to skip ahead. You can avoid the problems both of top down, which, as we know, tends to suffer from voltage drop and lack of uptake, and bottom up, which suffers from the problem that Neil has alluded to of poor spread. And I'll illustrate this using a study we did, or a project we did right at the beginning of the pandemic on building good practice for postpartum hemorrhage in women who are suspected COVID-19 positive. And we did this using our citizen science platform, which is called Discovery. And basically this was a 3-task exercise where we wanted to get large-scale participation. The initial task asked people to register on the platform from 3 different groups: maternity services, so healthcare professionals, infection prevention and control specialists, again, healthcare professionals, and human factors specialists, often engineers or other people who know how to design good systems. The first task showed people a 3.5-minute video that illustrated our way of handling this particular scenario. We knew it wasn't perfect, and we asked people to completely free text suggest how they would improve the practice they had seen there. So they're interacting with this system. They can suggest in their own words how they think it could be better. They can show where the improvement should be made. And then we compiled them into, by reducing duplicates, we were able to get to a kind of long list of recommendations for how to improve the practice seen in that video. Second task asked you to come back again, and then you got to vote on what you thought should be implemented and show how strongly you felt that. So again, what you're seeing is one of the recommendations that came out was that team roles should be very clearly identified, and that you were allowed to vote on. And we then, when it was a Delphi exercise, essentially, the third task then was to rate again in the light of vote from others. So we were trying to get to consensus, and we were able to reduce the initial 900 recommendations down to 22. And then finally, they were voted on again. We showed you what others had said and what you had voted, what you had said. And we were then able to get to a final list of 14 recommendations to improve the practice. And we're reshooting the video at the moment to illustrate that. So that was an example of consensus building a new SOP, essentially, that could be used anywhere that secured large-scale participation and the people really enjoyed taking part in, and that we think avoided the top-down versus bottom-up dichotomy. A second example of how you can use this kind of approach is understanding the problem and how it can be addressed. And very often when things are not going well in the NHS is because it's starting from an inaccurate characterization of the problem, or it hasn't taken sufficient perspectives into account. And here we were trying to develop an ethical framework for swab testing of NHS workers. We did a large-scale consultation using the citizen science platform, recruited through multiple channels, and we were able to recruit at scale very quickly. This was done in 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks actually. Nearly 100 people took part. We were able to identify issues that were particularly relevant to potentially disadvantaged groups, And we were then able to produce very quickly guidance on an ethical framework and very practical recommendations for people who are have a staff testing program for their organisation, and that's available free from our website. So that was something we could do very quickly, and we were very satisfied we were able to access views at scale. A further important challenge for COVID has been co-producing what good looks like, and making sure that there's clear understanding of that, and that you've taken the range of stakeholder views into account. A very important challenge has been remote care for people with chronic conditions. I don't just mean remote consultations, but how you look after people. And this is obviously a problem that affects typically quite disadvantaged groups in society, who may be particularly reliant on services and being able to be present. So how do you co-produce what good looks like there? So again, using Discovery, we were able to recruit clinicians and patients to look at their perspectives on what they'd experienced over the last few months, and build a perspective on what good would look like, which again we're now writing up. There were some really interesting findings from that. So we basically found that patients and clinicians were in agreement that there were 5 things that were suitable for remote care, but patients were disagreed with the clinicians on a further 5, and there were no consensus on the 4th. So that's a really important thing to discover, because it then means you can design your services in a way that takes account of what's important to patients. We've got another project open at the moment, which is looking at remote antenatal care, and if anyone wants to take part in that, they are most welcome. It's on our website. And again, what we're doing is trying to co-produce what good looks like, using the perspectives of women themselves and staff who are looking after patients and system level stakeholders. I'm also just going to very briefly mention a further way you can use this kind of technique, which is making hard decisions using multiple perspectives. So as many of you know, the pandemic has not only increased pressure on secondary mental health services, but also in some cases had a very profound impact on mental illness. And there have been very difficult decisions to be made about access to secondary mental health services. What has been happening is people arriving at services very, very severely ill, but reduced capacity because of risks of infection. So how do you make decisions about who needs to be admitted? So real dilemmas about how to assign priority. And what we're doing at the moment is using Discovery again to engage service users, their carers and staff to explore the influences, and then build best practice on how to address those issues. So it's this kind of participatory ethos that is guiding what we are doing. It's highly co-produced. We're working with a major charity, the McPin Foundation, and we've made diversity a priority in this one, as we have in fact in the antenatal one that's open at the moment. So the learning from this has been that it is possible to engage staff and patients in highly participatory problem characterization and problem solving. You can do it very fast, you can do it at scale, and you can do it remotely even during a pandemic. I think this kind of approach is highly scalable, and the results can help in reducing waste, getting better solutions, harmonizing across the NHS, and supporting curation of solutions and enabling evaluation. And I will stop there.
Thanks very much indeed, Mary. Just before I move on to Gary, this is obviously a wicked problem, isn't it? You want speed, you want to empower staff. On the other hand, you need evidence, and obviously there can be unforeseen consequences. I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming it really makes no difference whether it's a technological intervention or a service redesign. You can have the same issue can appear. I guess the question is, can people do this without your help? I mean, you're obviously helping but you can't be everywhere in every trust and every circumstance. Is this something you can build within your own organisation?
I think you can use a lot of the principles, and we're writing those up at the moment. The technology that sits behind what I've just described has taken a lot of investment, and I think that probably couldn't be replicated at scale. We're open to kind of people coming to us, and we can discuss what we might be able to do. But the basic principles of try to engage the relevant stakeholders, they are doable, and you can use really quite old-fashioned technologies for some of this, including simple questionnaire studies and so on, or simple questionnaire bits of software. So we'll very shortly be publishing the principles, and I think what I was really trying to demonstrate is not that we're going to solve every problem, but that it is possible to do this, it is possible to do it at scale, and it is possible to do it very fast. Most of the projects that I've been describing there were done in a matter of weeks, and were massively valued and enjoyed by the people who took part in them. We got feedback saying that I have felt really respected, I have felt valued. Even though you didn't take my recommendation into the final thing, at least I felt heard. So I think this listening thing, understanding the problem, and then being able to produce a good solution that takes account of perspectives is something we haven't always been as good at in the NHS as you would hope for. So then you get resentment and so on. But I think also the idea that you can do it in such a way that it reduces waste. So we're not having every single organisation coming up with a slightly different way of getting the patient through the operating theatre workflow, or whatever it's going to be.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Mary, and we'll come back to you for questions after we've heard from Gary. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Gary Forge, Chief Executive of the Oxford AHSN and Professor of Stroke Medicine at Oxford University. Gary's going to reflect on how we engage with innovation and innovators, including the need to be clear about the value proposition at an early stage and the need to develop a strategy for adoption and spread. Over to you, Gary.
Thank you very much, Neil. I'll cover some similar points to those that Mary has made about how you successfully get innovation adopted, and give some examples from the clinical pathway I've worked in for many years, stroke, and also some of the approaches we take as AHSNs working as an AHSN network. So the problem has been long-standing is, as many people are aware, we are world leading in life sciences research, and I think the response to the pandemic has yet again shown that. But by any metric, when you look at it, we are always, to be fair, world lagging in the adoption of outputs of research. But I think we have seen that during the pandemic, the NHS is capable of adapting and changing very rapidly. And I think that gives us cause for optimism as to how we can speed things up for the future. Although I lead an AHSN, what we really need is academic health science systems that go all the way from discovery to deployment. If you look at the distribution of funding, most of it is very much geared towards which is NIHR funding, and you have Research Council, Wellcome, MRC as well, to the discovery evaluation end. And there's not much national funding put into adoption and spread. And it's a question of whether this balance is right. In thinking about innovation, I very simplistically put it in 5 buckets: drugs, devices, digital, diagnostics, and design, and that's clinical pathway transformation. But a key point is, particularly for digital and diagnostics, but also for drugs, and I'll give you an example of this later, the real value is realized through clinical pathway redesign. And we would say always start with the pathway and think about the pathway. And also what has become a massive priority is increasing NHS workforce productivity. And that concept is important, and Simon Stevens talked about it when the test beds were created, the concept of combinatorial innovation rather than single point innovations. I won't talk much about how we work as HSNs. I mean, we are regionally based, so we have the local connections, but increasingly we work as a connected network of network. And our main role is to support the spread of high value innovation, import what's working best from other areas, identify innovation that is appropriate for us to focus on for giving nationwide implementation. But you do need these relationships for all this to work. So one of the problems is just this delay in the uptake. And I give 2 examples. One is a pathway redesign, in the sense creating stroke units, and the second is implementation of a drug. And I'm not going to talk through the detail there, but you can read it. From having the clear evidence, and in stroke units, it was clear back in 1993 from a meta-analysis in a large number of patients from 10 trials that they were of value in reducing mortality and disability. And a handful of us established stroke units back in after that in 1993. But if you look at how long it took for the majority of stroke patients to access stroke unit care, it was 17 years. And this is typically the sort of lag you see for widespread adoption. If we look at thrombolysis, more controversial, but again, some of us started 2 or 3 years after the first positive trial. But it was again another about 17 years before reasonable numbers of patients were receiving it. And we've now got up to a plateau of 12%, although probably there's still a treatment gap of another 5 or 8%. And this is a big opportunity cost. That opportunity cost can be patient benefit, which is what we often talk about. It can be cost savings, and it can be workforce productivity. So some of these points have already been covered by Mary. It's really important to think about the clinical pathway and to engage with stakeholders, both healthcare professionals and patients, and understand the NHS need. And researchers come at this from a different prism. They tend to come, if you're a clinical researcher, from the clinical area you work in. But when we surveyed last year what the innovation and research needs were of the NHS, talking to non-researchers, to managers and clinicians who had a broad view, so typically commissioners, medical directors, trust chief execs, chief operating officers. These are their priorities: workforce, which is rarely thought about by researchers; mental health, which is perhaps unsurprising, and people are aware of that; multimorbidity and frailty, for which there is a paucity of high value solutions. We need many more. And not so much more digital and artificial intelligence, but how best to use it. And I'll come back to that point. It's really important to have a clear value proposition that resonates with the adopter. And there have to be either a single unifying value proposition or different value propositions that are of value to patients, to commissioners, to clinicians, and to whoever controls the budget in a trust. And it's the answering the what's in it for me question. And you can't just go along with the view, this is a fantastic innovation, it helps patients. That won't get your innovation into the NHS. Mary's talked about the importance of engaging meaningfully with end users, and the approach she described, I think, is really interesting. We in the HSNs do a lot of meetings with end users, both patients and healthcare professionals, to understand their concerns, their views of an innovation. Probably something which needs more thinking about by organisations and is challenging is to get something new in, you have to have staff who have the time to do this, the concept of absorptive capacity within an organisation. And so that has to be thought about, because if you haven't got that, and you can't create it, it's very difficult to implement innovation. Evidence of benefit, again, Mary talked about this with one or two examples, in real world settings is very important. The whole question of whether a trial translates through, and in some areas like digital and diagnostics, often the evidence of benefit is weak. The other thing is we look through the prism of NICE at the value of treatments in quality adjusted life years, and that is highly appropriate. But the reality is, if you want to get something into the system, you have to have a credible financial impact plan and work out who's going to pay for it and who's going to benefit, and they're often not the same. So this is where the integrated care systems become very important in terms of healthcare systems working to make changes which require one part of the system to spend money to release benefits in another part. A real challenge is the short-term financial perspective of the NHS, and a wish that any proposal gives a return on investment in 1 year. It is exceptionally unusual to be able to realise a positive return on investment for innovation in 1 year, and we need a 3 to 5 year framework to really be able to sensibly plan and engage partners to adopt innovation. Neil has mentioned the issue of capital requirements. If your innovation requires capital investment, that can be extremely challenging. And I think we have to recognise that some innovation, although it's high value, it can be very hard to sell into the NHS. Patient safety is one example. It often has to be mandated to get adopted. So I give one example about the importance of clarity on accountability and this support for resourcing. This is a common approach being adopted, teledermatology. So instead of the old pathway of patients coming to see a consultant and receiving a diagnosis, you get a high resolution digital photograph when the patient attends a GP, and you send that to the consultant. And clearly in a COVID context, this sort of pathway redesign becomes even more attractive. However, this was unsuccessful, and it was when you talk. This is an example from another HSA in Wessex. When they talk to stakeholders, so GPs and consultants, the GPs found it required more effort. A bit of a faff was a sort of way of describing it. And then they said, and when we do this, they get called into outpatients anyway. So why was that? So the consultant said, well, we've tried to use this, but the image quality is very poor. And what was happening was, it was the lack of colour printer in another scenario that Mary talked about. The medical secretaries were printing off the images in black and white, which really didn't give high enough resolution or enough detail. So you have to really pay attention to detail, these sort of details in a pathway when you've got a good idea, because it often doesn't quite work out as you intended. And I often say any innovation implementation plan doesn't survive first contact with the NHS. You have to adapt it by listening to your stakeholders. I'll give an example of the importance of optimizing clinical pathways to realize the value of innovation. So this was back in 2005 when I was working in Newcastle. We had introduced thrombolysis 7 years before that, and it was established in our pathway, but it's a highly time-dependent treatment. So the earlier you treat people, the better they do, the more likely they are to avoid long-term disability. And the pathway was, we would have an acute stroke patient who'd be recognised through the FAST test in the community. They'd be brought in very rapidly, short distances to bring people to the ED in a city like Newcastle. They would seen by the ED triage nurse, and they would page the stroke registrar, who would be in the hospital. But to get a CT scan, the radiology department had said only consultants could get emergency CT scans, so it had to be discussed with the consultant. So the registrar would bring the stroke consultant, which would sometimes be myself. And we would always say, well, they clearly need a scan. They've got a fast positive. It happened an hour ago. It really doesn't merit discussion with me. So I'll come and assess the patient while she's organising the scan. Then the registrar would bring the radiology registrar, and all these take 2, 3, 4 minutes, often longer. But if the radiology registrar was difficult, they would say, no, we don't think we're going to do this. We don't agree. Then I'd have another phone call from the registrar, and of course that would raise my blood pressure, and I would call the registrar and say, why are you saying this? This is nonsense. This patient needs a scan. They'd always say yes, and then the radiographer would do the scan. Would contact the ED triage nurse, who would send the patient to the scanner. But typically this would take about 30 minutes. And if you've got a major stroke, that delay in 30 minutes in administering successful thrombolytic therapy costs you a lot of neurons. And this was all around protecting radiographer time, CT time, and this was a quote from Australian Professor of Stroke Medicine. But when I was on call at home, before you drive in to see the patient, sometimes my son, who was 13 at the time, would pick up the phone when the switchboard was ringing me for the registrar to speak with me. And you may be able to recognise he's got Down syndrome. And he would answer the phone and the switchboard would say, could we speak to Professor Ford, please? And it's the hospital. And he would say, get a scan. Because he'd heard me say this so many times that even he knew with his moderately severe learning disability what the NHS needed to do, but the NHS couldn't sort it out. Now, eventually, we got this sorted out, and this is what the pathway looks like in Newcastle. We cut out the registrar. We have nurse requesting under a protocol the CT. They request the CT. As the patient is being moved to the scanner, the consultant is then called and we go and see the patient in the scan. And in the 5% or so of cases where we are not clear about the scan, we would get a proper expert opinion from a consultant neuroradiologist. This has saved huge amounts of time, and that translates into clinical benefit, but it's also saved a huge amount of wasted time and increased productivity of staff. And in many clinical pathways, you find, maybe not as extreme as this, similar barriers. If we turn to digital innovation, one of the things is the evidence base is often weak. This is still evolving. People are thinking around what evidence do you need for digital. There's a lot of what I would refer to as snake oil out there with high claims but little evidence. And it's a very low barrier of entry, unlike drugs, devices and diagnostics. You can invent something, a digital solution for the NHS as a teenager in your bedroom. So I think one of the key important things is when we roll out digital, and we've had good examples of this and examples which have not delivered the promise. I think it's important to really think about real world evaluation, and because at the moment we don't have high quality research outputs for a lot of the stuff that is being put into the system. So this is an approach we're taking with stroke artificial intelligence imaging interpretation, which through algorithms diagnoses the presence of a particular type of stroke with large vessel occlusion on a CT angiogram, and that identifies people who are suitable for thrombectomy and need transferring if they're in a hospital without a neuroscience centre to a stroke centre that can undertake thrombectomy. And again, we've got this time critical element to it, but these scans are quite hard to read by non-experts. So what this does is it gives you instant readout any time of the day with high technical performance. So it's got that evidence. We know it works. It's as accurate as a neuroradiologist and more accurate than a general radiologist or a stroke physician. So what we're looking at as we roll this out across the Southeast region, and the pandemic has removed a lot of the barriers to getting this in, which has been helpful, is we're looking at not the technical performance, because that's been done. We're looking at what is the impact on the number of people who receive thrombolysis and thrombectomy and the rapidity in which they receive it. We're looking at the clinical pathways and what that does to workforce productivity, because this can take out a lot of steps of that. And we're also looking at the qualitative assessment of the views of healthcare professionals. And we know already that some healthcare professionals are opposed to this and come up with all sorts of arguments that it's unsafe, etc. And you have to understand these qualitative aspects to be successful in a delivery program. The other thing we've found is helpful is to produce rapid pragmatic guidance on service redesign. And when I was looking with colleagues at what could we do to support stroke services during the pandemic, there was a need to move to models of working that minimize face-to-face contact. So instead of consultants like myself who are moderate risk of a poor outcome if we were to acquire COVID, you move to remote decision-making mechanisms for thrombolysis. And these had already been around but had been only slowly adopted. And I'd been trying to persuade my colleagues in Oxford to adopt this approach for some years. But when the pandemic came, there was really no delay. And we saw over it's very difficult to oppose moving to that model of care. And we saw that move overnight, but people wanted advice on how to do that. So normally to produce guidance would take us about 6 months or so. That's the time we took to produce guidance on thrombectomy. But with this, we met weekly with a group of partners from GIRFT, from the British Association of Stroke Physicians. We supported it with a medical writer and one of my managers, and we produced guidance within 6 weeks of starting and used this framework from REBA about what to end, what to amplify, what to restart, what to let go. And then we did a similar thing with GIRFT for the recovery period. And I think key is working with these key organisations relevant to what you're doing. So in this case, it was GIRFT and the British Association of Stroke Physicians, and also capturing through a resource hub examples of solutions that people had found. So it becomes a living document. I'm near the end of my time, so I'll quickly go through this. These are thoughts from Ken Gabriel about how you get disruptive breakthrough innovation in. And there's something around, you need that bold capability of people in the NHS. Fixed budgets is interesting because you're normally working with very little budget. I mean, that's where we can help with the small budgetary support we can provide as an HSN. And this balance between control for safety and freedom. And when you see successful organizations, they do have a lot of autonomy in successful clinical units. These are a couple. We've recently had a group of researchers from City University in collaboration with a couple of HSN study experiences of how we spread adoption. And these are two examples of how we worked in response to the pandemic. One was, again, we're rapidly rolling out digital and video consultation in primary care in partnership with NHSX, NHS England and NHS Improvement. And that, I think, has been very successful. And that collaborative partnership approach we found is important. And second is responding to local need, being aware of that, having those connections with the local community to be able to have those conversations. And then finally, these are early, this is my last slide, these are early findings from the study around how we responded to the pandemic, the importance of speed and flexibility, the need for a range of strategic responses. In a way, we've been able to enhance our relationships with local system partners, and this issue that partners felt they were listened to and worked with rather than done to. And the pandemic has undoubtedly had a major shift on the way we've worked and strengthened our relationship with some of the regional and ICS structures. And I would emphasise again the need to collect evidence as you roll out. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Gary. Now we've got about 15 minutes or so left, so do put in, I think we've got one question in at the moment, which I'll come to, but we've got about 15 minutes or so, so do put any questions or comments into the chat function. Gary, if I can just pick up that sort of point about, you talked about real world evaluations, about collaboration, ability to have conversations and so on. And I want in this 15 minutes, if we can, to kind of look through all this through the eyes of senior managerial types, possibly clinicians or whatever, within provider organizations largely, and through their mindset and where they take this. Can you just reflect for a moment on what your view of your clinical colleagues is around this? In one sense, deeply depressing, though I don't think it's any surprise to any of us, that it might take 17 years for some innovation to actually come through, and we've got to try and move to a different thing. I'm not incidentally blaming clinicians for that, because it's obviously a very complex set of factors. But where do you think the clinical community is, and is there an opportunity that COVID has provided to sort of see a change of mindset within that clinical community, as well as managers and others stepping forward?
Well, I certainly think there has been. I mean, it's a mixed picture, isn't it? I mean, I think in many services, I mean, stroke being one, but there are many other acute services, maternity, we've seen as another, emergency mental health services. Clinicians have implemented change very rapidly. They've learned how to adapt their consultation style, the way we manage patients. They're looking for other solutions to support what they do. So one very simple pragmatic solution we need if you're a secondary care consultant or specialist is being able to, after you've done a virtual consultation, initiate a prescription in the community without having to bring the patient back. That's an IT problem. It's a simple problem. Everybody can see it's soluble, but it is surprisingly difficult, and it's out with the clinician's power to implement that. So I think people are willing to change very rapidly. I think that's where we can help in providing evidence and support that what you're doing is safe and it's it is delivering good results, and also sharing experience rapidly. And UCLP worked with intensive care unit to share experience around the management of COVID at the beginning, which intensive care unit started, which I think was very successful. But on the other hand, you've got clinicians who, and I'm careful about speaking on their behalf, who must be completely frustrated because they have to stop doing things completely, like many of the surgeons. And what they need is solutions to be able to them to get going again and to be able to get the productivity through their stuff again. Because and that again is, I think, where we can help, as can other organisations, in how do you do the airflow exchange if you've got to have that quicker, how do you use PPE. I mean, the example from Mary quoted I think was really important and interesting. So I think people are looking for solutions now much more than before. So I'm an optimist by nature, but people want to change. They get frustrated when they try and change, and they don't understand the system. They don't have the QI skills. They don't have the managerial support, and they tend to give up. And I think that's what we try and give people.
And maybe I could apply this next question first to you, Gary, and then Mary. You talked about this mismatch of priorities, which I think is really interesting. And in a way, it's a challenge to your community, as it were, the research community, the innovation community, and so on, about what people were working on, and then what were the things that were really bothering people who are running organizations, and how do we get that better aligned?
Yeah, some of it is not necessarily turning off a research program you're doing and completely changing it. And the reality is that's not going to happen. I think it's just thinking about, if I take two examples, but all of those you could take, but workforce productivity. Okay, that could be measured as an outcome in any research project, any study, but it tends not to be because it's not seen of primary interest. So I think it's about tweaking what you do. If you're implementing a digital solution, just thinking a bit harder and talking to us, NHSX, other organisations that are going to have to support it. What would we say you need to know, and exploring that at an early stage rather than later stage. So I think it's more about a little bit of adjustment, and also we find our value is explaining the reality of what it is to get something in. And researchers and clinicians, and I'm still one of them, we tend to focus entirely on patient benefit, but you have to look at these other factors if you want to be successful. So I don't think it's about rapidly changing things. I do think there is capacity building needed and more research in mental health and in multimorbidity. But to be fair, the research community and funders have already recognised that, and they're responding to that.
Mary, what's your take on that?
You're on mute.
Sorry, I loved Gary's story about stroke, and it's interesting. We used it when we launched our institute. You may have seen the play that we wrote from the perspective of the patient, going through exactly what you're describing, and that's now available. We filmed it, and it's available with a script if anyone wants to run it as a simulation on our website. But I think this business of how you reconcile the multiple perspectives, and even understanding that there are multiple perspectives. I mean, your story was the radiologist had one set of priorities, the stroke physicians had another, and understanding that that's the problem you're trying to solve is often the key. And as you say, the argument for patient benefit is persuasive, but on its own, it's not enough to secure an innovation. And something to do with ensuring that you've characterised the problem correctly, that you're targeting the multiple facets of that problem, and doing so in such a way that you're bringing people with you seems to be part of the key.
And do you think, I mean, again, could have applied, start with Mary and then Gary, is there Is there a way round this ROI problem? Apart, I mean, I mentioned the Treasury issue of capital funding, but it's something that's pretty endemic in the NHS, which is, whoa, if you can't show a benefit, then within a year, then it's not going to work, sort of stuff. What needs to happen either within the leadership of organisations or systems or whatever to enable a longer time frame to materialize and thereby encourage and sustain innovation? Oh.
You're on mute, Mary.
Mary, on mute.
Sorry, the phrase of 2020. Some of that may be about producing better evidence.
Mary, you're on mute. Can you hear me?
No, you're fine now. No,
sorry, there's a bit of a delay with getting my mic to come back on again.
I think you're still on mute, aren't you?
No, you're fine.
Mary, we can't hear you.
I can hear you,
I think
Mary.
you can't hear me, Neil.
Oh, is it me? Oh, well, I can hear you now. I couldn't for a minute. Okay, sorry.
So some of it, I think, is about producing better evidence of this, and I completely agree with Gary that we have been poor about costing some of this stuff, or understanding that business cases have to be made. So I think there are ways we can package innovation more effectively, but also producing evidence about the length of time it takes to implement these things. One of the things we discovered when we were doing that postpartum hemorrhage project was how desperately people in the service want wide-mouthed bins. Now, I had no idea this was an issue, but this was one of the most frequently requested recommendations, was please let us have a wide-mouthed bin. Who would know something so mundane would be so important to people? And how would you even construct a business case asking for a wide-mouthed bin? So I think those very mundane innovations sometimes get no attention. They're not glamorous. They're not some fancy bit of equipment, and people have no idea how you would put something together. But I think there's also about building the evidence base about the longer term on which you've got to plan this. And Neil, I think to your point, we probably need some kind of policy shift as well.
Really interesting. Gary, what's your thought on that?
So I think, first of all, you have to have a clear strategy and plan for what you're trying to achieve in terms of the priority improvement in the system, particularly for something like prevention, which never gives a positive return on investment in 1 year for obvious reasons. I think that's really clear, and I think one of the problems is you're not allowed for everything not to be a priority. So ICSs have got 100 priorities, and so when I chaired our recent ICS board, I said, okay, so we'll have the clinicians decide what are the top priorities, and then we'll have the other priorities. But if you don't have priorities, it kind of then not really even working. And then once you've agreed those, I think you have to essentially top slice your budget to say this bit isn't going to give return on investment. That this is an investment in 1 year. This is an investment that will deliver in 3 or 5 years. And we probably have to accept if something can't deliver a positive return on investment in 5 years, it's going to be challenging unless it's a major hospital capital building, and that it is a problem because at the moment we kind of skirt around it, because if we really we're running a lipid management familial hypercholesterolemia national program. The HSNs will support building on the work we did in atrial fibrillation. Well, the current diagnosis of people with FH in this country is in England is 4%. And people without treatment die in their 40s, 50s. It is completely avoidable. But that requires investment, and that is in the long-term plan. So you have to translate that clear target, aspiration, ambition, long-term plan into a financial framework, and that is a challenge, I think, right challenge to put to the commissioners right at the top and then all the way down.
Okay, let's just take a couple of questions from the audience. There's a bit of a theme about participation in some questions. Sabi Redwood has asked a question for Mary. Mary, you mentioned your commitment to include a diverse range of participants for one of your projects in particular. Can you speak about how you're doing this, and how has the use of a phone app helped in that process?
Yes, it has. So within Discovery, we offer a range of ways of participating. So you can complete what we call an on-demand interview, where you're essentially shown text questions and you can speak in response. And that means you can do the interview anytime you like. A second one is to schedule online an interview with an interviewer who will then talk to you, and a third is quite old-fashioned kind of survey, open response type thing, so that we've used those successfully in participation. There's always a worry with using digital that you disadvantage some groups. We've actually been finding we're increasing participation. There are people who would never want an interviewer coming to their house or never turn up to a clinic or something, who are very happy to participate in this way. Staff like it because they can choose when they're going to do things. And we think it is increasing diversity, actually, because particularly at-risk groups have been reluctant to travel. So we think it solves some of the problems of participation and diversity. It has obviously created new ones as well. And we've been very sensitive to the issue of exclusion. So we're offering different techniques for people who might be excluded digitally, very old-fashioned phone calls and so on. So I think the solution is actually having a menu of options available, but not abandoning it just because it doesn't solve every single problem.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. And then we've got one from, is it Tarzan Baines, who's asked, is the rapid development of protocols and guidelines going to be the new normal, or will things revert back to the way it was pre-pandemic? And I suppose from either of you, just a more general reflection as well about how much has this stimulus of the pandemic going to really drive things in a different way going forward, and how far do you think inevitably, you know, to use that old analogy, the grass will grow through the railway line again? Gary.
It's important there's a difference between working quickly but using the same rigor in what you do. You know, the processes by which NICE works, I mean, they're already looking to speed up, but you know, the guidance they produce needs to maintain the rigor of their high quality processes. So there's only so fast you can go. I think when you're sharing experience of how to run services, some of it is you don't need to do a randomized controlled trial for wide bucket bins or whatever, wide mouth bins. It's just it's got high face validity and there is no safety risk to it. So I think the important thing is really thinking carefully what needs what's just just go ahead and do it. It's an obvious simple solution. What needs real world evaluation? So as you roll it out, you just check everything's fine. And what needs research, because it's not clear about the risk and benefit. And there's interesting issues like, we do need more studies around how video consultation is used, for example, because it's been widely deployed. And it does, I haven't got time to talk about it, but it does, the interaction with patients has changed subtly. I've seen that from moving from seeing TI patients in person to calling them on the phone. It is a different interaction.
Mary?
Couldn't agree more, and I love this point about how we tend to think that there's a single one-size-fits-all model for evaluation, and I think we could get better at classifying things that are kind of good enough evidence. The wide mouth bin might be a good one. Ones where we should proceed with caution, and I think we could do an awful lot more studies in real time, bundled with improvement efforts. So we're basically scaling improvement efforts, doing that at scale, but testing things very rapidly, rapid cycle tests in local environments, and capturing data in that way that are not full-blown research studies, but are testing, iterating, and getting to good enough evidence about these particularly mundane interventions. Nobody's ever going to pay for a trial, but we still want to know what's the best way of doing this. How do you optimize its deployment? What are the work system requirements? Is there anything you need to change? So I would really love if we could get closer to this idea of different types of interventions or different types of things, and how we can get good enough evidence for each of those. I think that's an excellent point.
Okay, I've got a final question. Carl Bridge, who asks, what support have we or is developing for elderly and vulnerable people currently using Bridget? And Bridget apparently is a solution for elderly people who have not had access to the internet or know how to use mobile applications. I don't know if either of you are aware of that or how far it is being used. Obviously, there is a challenge of moving to a digital world where that people will be excluded and as currently, although obviously the numbers who are able to interact is now very overwhelming. Have either of you got a thought on that?
I don't know that particular solution. What we are doing as National Network and with the Royal College of Physicians and other groups is looking at the clinically extremely vulnerable groups and what support they need. So I think very much that, which includes the older people with multiple morbidity, but also includes other groups as well, of course. So I think that problem has certainly been recognised, and I think it is an important one.
Okay, thank you.
Agreed.
Okay, listen, can I thank you both enormously for a really stimulating set of things. I hope that those of you who've been listening and watching have found it useful and stimulating. I hope you'll continue to follow both what the AHSNs and the Health Foundation and this Institute are doing, as well as the NHS Reset campaign that we're running within the Confederation. If I have, which I'm sure I will have done, not responded to all of the chat questions, I'm now going to commit Gary and Mary. At least we will get answers from them. If there's anything that you require an answer from that we haven't managed to do it during the course of the webinar. Thanks very much, all of you, for participating. And thanks again to Mary and Gary.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.